sincere thanks, Olivia. I very much appreciate it. It's an honor and a pleasure being here. And I'm grateful to Simon and the other conference organizers for this opportunity and for the honor of spending a little bit of time with you all. I thought what I would do is spend a little bit of time sharing some of my own challenges with you ever since the Arab uprisings in terms of some of the intellectual questions that have confronted all of us in terms of kind of a stockpiling of what it is that we know, what it is that what are some of the questions that we don't know, and what are some of the areas that we don't know, and what are some of the questions that we ought to be asking as we look over to the next couple of years in terms of the landscape of the study of the Middle East. So let me first start with saying a couple of things about what we have learned since the uprisings back in late 2010, early 2011. So what are some of the things we do know? Well, first and foremost, we have discovered, and we now know, that there's been an authoritarian retrenchment across the Middle East. We see that authoritarian systems have now become far more repressive than they were prior to 2010, 2011, and that they have devised in many ways new means of repression, and they have become far more repressive in terms of police states or the mukhabarat states that they used to be. And part of this authoritarian retrenchment are the sources of state resilience. We have really done, I think a number of scholars have done an incredible job looking at sources of state resilience. There's been really fruitful studies done on new patterns that have emerged in civil-military relations. I was very interested in the study of civil-military relations, and I discovered that really in the 1990s and in the 2000s, hardly anyone had studied civil-military relations in the Middle East. That had been something that had been studied in the 1960s and the 1970s, and that hadn't necessarily been the case. So ever since 2011, there have been some excellent studies that have come out, not just by Zoltan Baranay at the University of Texas in Austin, but by a whole host of emerging scholars who have looked at not just the role of the military and the police institutions, but also at other sources of state resilience. And also along the same lines, some excellent work has been done on the adaptability of institutions, how institutions that were once inflexible and therefore prone to collapse or prone to being broken have really proven themselves adaptable. And we've seen this particularly in relationship to the study of the adaptability of the Syrian state, for example, and how some institutions have been adaptable, others have proven to have a certain amount of institutional stickiness. And so the sources of institutional resilience and adaptability have been relatively well studied. And of course, equally fruitful and equally enriching have been a number of studies done on rentierism. We have been very fortunate to benefit from some excellent work by Stefan Hertog, Courtney Freer, and a whole other host of scholars on the different aspects of rentierism in terms of the role of political Islam in rentierism, how has rentierism enabled many states to weather the 2010-2011 uprisings, and now we know, for example, that our traditional conceptions of rentierism have been turned upside down. Where I am in the heart of the Persian Gulf, we used to think, when we studied rentierism, we used to think that economic downturns, for example, will confront rentier political economies with serious structural deficiencies and challenges. And what we've seen in places like Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait is that when these kinds of rentier states encounter problems, we see that the merchant classes and the entrepreneurial classes become far more dependent on the state. And ironically, through these process of challenges, the institutional resilience of the state is deepened and strengthened because of rentier problems. And so our assumptions about rentierism have changed and have evolved. And so we have learned an awful lot in these areas in relation to the study of the Middle East, in terms of authoritarian retrenchment, sources of state resilience, institutional adaptability and stickiness, and rentierism. And these are just four of the themes that I want to highlight. Of course, there have been really impressive studies that have been generated across an entire spectrum of the study of politics of the Middle East, but these are some of the themes that I wanted to highlight. What are some of the things we don't know? What are some of the areas that at least have not received the attention that perhaps they could have? And there, again, there's a whole host of them, but partly because of intellectual currents and what our collective interests take us, partly because of actual political developments in the real world out there, outside of the academia. There have been some areas that I think haven't received necessarily the attention that they could. One is the political engagement of Islam, Islam's emerging or evolving politics when and if it becomes part of the regular political process. We only have one case study. It's an incredible, very fruitful case study, and that's Tunisia. But there was a window of opportunity where we thought we could actually see political engagement of Islam in a very meaningful, substantive way in Egypt as Islam in power, and that didn't happen. And so after the Arab Spring, we only have the case of Tunisia that we can look at. What does it mean when Islam becomes part of the state? And of course, earlier in the 1980s, we had the case of Iran. We've had the case of Iran since the 1978-79 revolution. But of course, Islam's political engagement is one of those areas that were studied earlier, and then of course we have moved on to other factors. Another topic that received a lot of attention in the 1970s and in the 1980s and somewhat in the 1990s, but in many ways as a phenomenon peaked in the Arab Spring, but its study was not necessarily pursued in a way that perhaps it could have been, is the continued political efficacy of nationalism. One of the things we saw in the Arab Spring process was this zenith, this peak of nationalism, where we saw in the streets of Cairo, for example, elsewhere, where people were engaged in expressions of citizenship, expressions of national identity. And that study hasn't necessarily, that theme hasn't been picked up. It has, interestingly, been lately picked up here in the region, in the Arabian Peninsula, with the blockade or boycott of Qatar by the trio, or by the by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and United Arab Emirates, and therefore the emergence of nationalism in places like here in Qatar and in the UAE, kind of this militaristic patriotism in the UAE and in bin Salman, Saudi Arabia. But elsewhere in the Middle East, we see that that study has not necessarily been subsided. And one of the other things that we see, and that hasn't necessarily been a theme that hasn't been picked up, is the inclusive nature of Middle Eastern studies. We continue to operate in silos. Those of us who specialize on the Arab region continue to study the Arab region. Those of us who study Iran continue to study Iran. Those of us who study Turkey continue to study Turkey. And those of us who study Israel study Israel. We don't necessarily engage in comparative cross-country or at least regional studies. We don't study West Asia per se. We don't necessarily look at some of these comparative dynamics that can necessarily be found in places like, in most alike cases, Iran and Turkey, for example. And we continue to operate in silos. And I moving forward, I would love to see more studies on that engage in these cross-country or broader comparative thematic studies of the region. And kind of course, I'm not calling for multidisciplinary studies only, but I think it would be really fruitful to see the political efficacy and political significance of some of these dynamics that can be found across some of the across the Middle East, including in not just the Arab region, but also in Iran. I would love to see more studies that include Turkey, Iran, and Israel as part of a broader comparative study. Finally, let me end with some questions that I think we ought to be asking. What are some of the questions that at least animate my own intellectual curiosity? And I think I'm by no means alone. I think some of the questions that are out there, in addition to what to these areas that we haven't necessarily studied. First and foremost, I think we need more and fresh outlook on means of state domination. The kinds of studies that Lisa Wedeen has done recently on ambiguities of domination in relation to Syria. It would be, what are some of the ways in which states are resilient beyond institutional efficacy, beyond the ability to continually repress people? What is it about societies that make them even begrudgingly politically complacent? And I think that is an important area. And again, whether this is country specific or case specific or broader and comparative, I think these means of state domination that go beyond institutions, beyond rentierism, beyond police states, beyond civil military relations, go back in many ways at means of state hegemony. And what are some of the ways in which society becomes dispirited and simply wants to assume a routine of life outside of the political arena? I think that would be an interesting set of questions that really beg to be asked. A second set of questions, and probably this is informed by my geographic location here in the heart of the sectarian um, uh, sectarian nerve center of the Middle East, is the future of sectarian sensibilities. To what extent are we seeing the peak or the demise or the spread of sectarian sensibilities? A couple of years ago, about 5 or 10 years ago, we saw extremely interesting studies by emerging and established scholars like Toby Matheson that looked at sectarianism. And to what extent is this sectarianism rooted in societies? To what extent does it speak to the anguish and anxieties of populations? And not just in places that are openly sectarian, divided along sectarian lines, like Bahrain, for example. To what extent does sectarianism speak to the broader sensibilities of folks in Iran, folks in places like Egypt, outside of those typical sectarian areas? Are we seeing the emergence of a new wave whereby our lens, in the same way that we saw the Middle East through the lens of nationalism in the 1960s and the 1970s, and nationalism colored everything or informed everything, does sectarianism today informs everything, or are we seeing its decline? Are we seeing its decline as a compelling informative force in societies? I would particularly love to see studies of sectarianism in Iran that place Iran in a broader comparative perspective. That is one area that begs to be studied, Iranian sectarianism. And being based here in Qatar, I get an awful lot of political opinion about Iranian sectarianism, but I really haven't seen in-depth studies, academic studies of sectarianism in a place like Iran. But I think that is something that is quite interesting. And then related to this, and last but by no means least, at least something that animates my own curiosity, are emerging intellectual currents. What intellectual currents are there that that are informing people in the Middle East? And I'm not just talking about people like me who sit in an air-conditioned room and in the intellectually comforting arena of Georgetown University, Qatar, and kind of pontificate about Iran or some other part of the Middle East. What does my counterpart at the University of Tehran, at the University of Alexandria, University of Shiraz, at University of Damascus, what animates that academic? What animates that intellectual, and not just public intellectual? What are some of the deep intellectual currents that are emerging inside the Middle East, not just by talking heads that we all know of, and we kind of go and for 2 weeks we go and do field work and we talk to them and we see them and we come and they make a useful footnote for our next book or article. But what is it that is really going on? Is there anything of substance? And I have to tell you, I don't know, but every time I go and I spend a little bit of time among PhD students in Iran or elsewhere in the Middle East, it's an incredible wake-up call. I get excited, I get rejuvenated, and I realize that the questions that I'm asking and the questions that I think are intellectually important are really not the ones they're asking. They're asking questions that have an awful lot to do with what is going on the ground, what is happening in their daily lives, what is it that is happening. And yes, there's an awful lot of regurgitation. There's an awful lot of translation that they read or they try to animate themselves. But one of the interesting things that we're seeing is that uh, there are really exciting intellectual currents oftentimes percolating in some academic circles or some other thought circles in the Middle East, on the field, with which those of us outside are not necessarily in close touch. And again, I am fully aware, as someone who does work lately, I've been doing work on Iran, I'm fully aware of the security risks involved. I'm fully aware of the difficulties of doing field work in a place like Iran, Egypt, Iraq, of course, but even in an ostensibly safe place like the UAE, it's not easy. I'm fully aware of it. But there's really fascinating stuff that is going on in our subjects of study with which we're not always in close contact and in close touch. These are some of the questions that have been bothering me, and I thought I would share that with you. I look forward to a fruitful discussion as we move forward for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Professor Kamrava. Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. And it's been
If I may ask, Olivia, just call me Mehran, please.
Thank you so much, Mehran. Since it is an official event, I stick to the protocol. Thank you so much. Well, then, if you would be ready, then we could take advantage of the time, and then we could already move into the question and answer session right away. We have already 2 questions from Guy Burton, and I will read them out loud so that everybody, maybe the ones who are not able to see the chat can also know what they are. So Guy's first question is, why do you think there haven't been cross-regional studies? Is that a question of language? And the second question is, what of the international relations level of the region over the past decade? Would you have any thoughts regarding how it has changed since 2011? And what would we have studied, not studied, should we study? Oh, you're muted, Mehran.
Sorry, thank you very much. And thank you for reading the questions, Olivia. I'm trying to squint and to see them, but so I'm grateful that you read them. I think part of there's of course much room and much need, deep need for individual studies. I think part of the reason is languages. Part of it is our own training. In graduate school, we're always told that we need to delve deep into the subject of our study. And I think in many ways we've been trained not to do these kind of broader cross-regional studies. But I also find sometimes and I speak from personal experience, I get caught in disciplinary narcissism, where I think that my subject is better than somebody else's subject, and I kind of don't want to bother. And it was really interesting. Sometimes I talk to my colleagues, and they consider themselves Middle East experts, but their geographic definition of the Middle East per se tends to be much narrower than the general conception of the Middle East. So I don't know the answer to that as to exactly why. Part of it is language. Part of it is, I think, our own training and the fact that we have rightly immersed ourselves deep in the study of a specific case. In terms of the study of international relations and how that has changed. And this in some ways relates to what we said, what I just said earlier. In 2005, I wrote a book called The Modern Middle East. And it was one of these broad cross-regional studies of the Middle East that included a bunch of places. And I didn't even mention, I don't think, the Persian Gulf region. I didn't mention Qatar, Abu Dhabi. And when I talked about Saudi Arabia, it was about our own kind of our traditional conceptions of Saudi Arabia as having led OPEC and what we thought. And one of the things we have seen, particularly since the Arab Spring, is that the traditional diplomatic centers of gravity, Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad, they have been eclipsed by new and emerging actors that once we didn't even consider them important enough to mention, and that is Doha, Abu Dhabi, and these guys have become not just important, but they've become quite consequential. So on the one hand, what we see is that the center of gravity is beginning to shift in terms of diplomatically and internationally consequential actors in the region. On the other hand, and this is something that I became quite interested in terms of IR is concerned, I think we need to rethink our traditional conceptions of power, because historically we've been thinking about power in terms of hard power and then soft power and then a combination of the two, meaning smart power. But at least in the lead up to the Arab Spring, in the early 2000s, we saw that a country like Qatar, which is young, which doesn't have a deep history of statehood, it doesn't have a demography. We saw that this country was successfully, to use a metaphor that has been overused, this country successfully punched above its weight and became consequential in terms of not just mediation, but in a whole host of other arenas. And so I asked, or there were people who were thinking that we need to rethink our traditional conceptions of power. We can't necessarily think of power only in military terms. What about the ability to shape an agenda? What about an ability to secure a place at the table for a country like Qatar, where we didn't even consider it significant enough? And so, again, at the risk, I'm reluctant to say this because I don't want to advocate for my own argument, but I called for our attention to something that I called subtle power. And I said, look, power might be soft, power might be hard, but sometimes power is exerted behind the scenes. Sometimes it's exerted in much more subtle ways, in terms of agenda setting, in terms of brand recognition, in terms of selling yourself as a consequential player, as a successful mediator. When you mediate successfully in the Darfur conflict, when you mediate successfully in Lebanon, elsewhere. And so, our conceptions need to change in some ways. Olivia, I think I answered, or at least I tried, those two areas.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Brilliant. I must say that also personally resonates with me, what you have been saying. As somebody being interested very much in symbolic politics, I second that, what you have said. I would like to then move on to a question by Genevieve Abdo. And she says, my question regards political Islam. She says, you mentioned that state adaptation and resilience. How do you think Islamist groups have adapted? Is there a future for a movement such as the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt to return to power in an Arab state?
My Georgetown colleague, Abdullah Al-Aryan, has done some really excellent work on the Muslim Brotherhood and its transformation after the Arab Spring. And his argument is that the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization might not necessarily exist as we've known it, because it could have possibly been successfully suppressed, but as an intellectual current, as a means of expression, it continues as an ideology and as a form of expression, as a form of political expression. It continues, and I tend to agree with him. I think the fact that we didn't see this engagement of Islam in the political process, and the fact that we're seeing a proactive suppression of expressions of political Islam in places like the UAE, then therefore means that it will continue to have a future. So in politics. So insofar as the Muslim Brotherhood, or at least what the Muslim Brotherhood signifies, is concerned, I think there is still much future for that version of Islam and its engagement in politics. What would be also equally interesting to think through is the future of Islam, future of political Islam in Iran. Again, placing this in a comparative perspective. Has Islam as a political force been effectively discredited because of its political use or abuse by the Islamic Republic state in Iran? Or will we see the emergence of a different political Islam in Iran? So I think that's quite an interesting question to ponder.
Thank you very much, Mehran. Let's then move on to the next one. We are not having too much time anymore, only 10 minutes left. If you want me to group the questions, let me know. I can also give
that would be great, if you don't mind. That would be great.
So we have one question from Yassim. He says Yassim in Bahrain, so I think he's located in Bahrain, and he says, do we do enough about the deep state in Iran and elsewhere in the Middle East? So that's one. And shall I read you the other, the next one?
Let me just answer the question of the deep state. So this, Jassim, maybe afterwards we can be in touch, because there has been an excellent study of the deep state. I forget his name, but it's called From the Deep State to the Islamic State. And it's a brilliant work that came out, brilliant book that came out by Hearst and Oxford University Press, co-published. One of the only books I've seen. Thank you very much. Yes, Jean-Pierre Filiu, one of the only works that I've seen. See, Simon is a brilliant mind. One of the best books I've seen, best works I've seen on the topic. Right now, it just so happens I'm doing some work on the deep state in Iran. I haven't seen anything on the deep state in Iran. There have been lots of studies on the IRGC and others. And interestingly, I just came across an article in Farsi published in Iran, in an Iranian academic journal, that talks about this, the quote unquote shadow government, which means the same thing in Iran. But hopefully I'll have a study on that at some point in not too distant future.
Brilliant. And thanks, Simon, for popping that in. So in Mustafa Menshawi, he would like to know, first he thanks you, Mehran, for the fascinating talk. And he says, a question, please. So there's a mass corpus of literature on sectarianism. moving to the policy-oriented side of finding solutions, is there a way to de-sectarianize the region? That is, reduce or downplay or perhaps eradicate the sectarian tendencies?
Ibrahim Farehat, who happens to be based in Doha, just came out with a book on Iran, Saudi Arabia, Taming a Chaotic Conflict, Iran-Saudi Relations, Taming a Chaotic Conflict. And Ibrahim is an expert on conflict resolution. The book just came out in 2020 by University of Edinburgh Press. And he has some excellent suggestions on moving forward, kind of thinking outside the box and de-sectarianizing the conflict between these guys, including, for example, establishing some common sense, quite simple solutions, establishing a hotline between Tehran and Riyadh, having expert committees work. I happen not to be a fan of track 2 diplomacy, because you either get a bunch of people who are on the same page and they all talk about cultural understanding, or you kind of get people who shout at each other and use track 2 as an opportunity to state their respective positions. I'm a big fan of security dialogue, get people to talk about their very real fears, but have very strict or very well-defined parameters of making sure that people state their questions and talk about the red lines beyond which they're not willing to go, and have them be willing to kind of hear the other side. I think, you know, in the Arab-Israeli conflict, we often say that in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we often say no side has a monopoly of fear from the other side. Each side genuinely fears the other side. And I think when it comes to sectarianism, we need to adopt the same mentality, that neither side has a monopoly of fear of the other side, that each side really has an existential fear of the other one. And at some point, we need to engage in a meaningful dialogue, and that dialogue needs to really start. Let's just go to security. What are some of the security problems? And I think a realization that you cannot, if you're Saudi or if you're kind of Sunni sectarian, you cannot wish Iran away. If you're Iranian and Shia sectarian, happen to be Shia sectarian, you cannot wish Saudi Arabia away or wish Sunnism away. And you need to really engage in some meaningful dialogue in that in that sense.
Right. And then I would like to pose 2 at a time, if possible, if you agree. We have one from Simon himself, and then we have also one from Arif Bijan. And Simon would like to, well, also thank you, and it was a wonderful talk. And he asked, what advice would you give to early career scholars setting out on the study of the post-Arab uprisings in the Middle East? And so what advice to early career scholars? And Arif Bijan also thanks you for this good speech. And he says, my question is that a new order is emerging in the Middle East. Will the role of regional and trans-regional actors such as Iran, Russia, Turkey, Saudi, Israel change fundamentally? That is, are we moving towards a regional coalition? If this hypothesis is correct, what is Iran's position in this new order? Well, it's quite extensive.
Yeah, let me first say, let me tackle the tough one first, which is Simon's question, which is what career advice I have, which is really not what PhD supervisors usually give. PhD supervisors rightfully give the advice of specialize on a topic that's marketable, something that will get you that first position. And if you're looking at the United States, let it be a tenure track position or something like that. I am still, I'm old enough to remember a brilliant article that was written by James Bill in the 1990s in Middle East Journal, tracing what he called intellectual fads. And he said, look, what we're doing is we're going from one topic to another. And so we're studying, and by the early 1990s, when the article was published, he said, now we're studying civil society and we're dropping everything else. And now we're studying civil society. And that's what's going to get you the job if you study civil society in the Middle East. And that's my generation of academics. My advice is kind of pursue your intellectual curiosity, ask questions that nobody else is asking, and kind of see what it is that really animates you. You're going to be stuck with this topic for the next 3-4 years of your life. You're going to live it, you're going to breathe it, eat it, sleep with it, wake up to it, and so find out something that really animates you intellectually, and pursue it, whether or not you think it's going to get you that job. And if it's something that's solid, if it's something that's that you can really, where your excitement and your own deep intellectual engagement shows, then you will be able to write that brilliant dissertation, and you will be able to land that publishing contract with a top tier press that you like, and that will get you the job eventually. So tough it out. And full disclosure, I got my PhD at Cambridge University, and my first job outside of the market was a hotel concierge. And so if you can tough it out, and I toughed it out, if you can tough it out, you will, you'll be able to manifest, to give realization to your intellectual interest and intellectual curiosity. Then there was a question about and I apologize, Olivia, for I know I'm going over, but I'll be very quick. One of the things we see, and this goes in relation to the question about the IR, we have seen the emergence of a pyramid in the Middle East of 4 powers at the tip of this pyramid, 4 regional powers, and these 4 have developed a marriage of convenience, 2 on one side and 2 on the other. 2 on one side are Israel and Saudi Arabia, 2 regional powers that are, you might think of, status quo power. And then the 2 other ones that want to revise or revisionist powers are Iran and Turkey. And this is just purely a marriage of convenience. Supporting these 4 at the tip of the pyramid are a group of countries that somehow fall in the middle of this regional power pyramid. And some of these powers were once, some of these actors were once dominant powers regionally, and they have, for a variety of reasons, fallen. Some want to emerge as the top powers. And so what we see are a bunch of countries that fall in the middle. And these are countries like Kuwait, Oman. I would put Egypt here, Morocco, Algeria. Algeria is a power in relation to Africa, not in relation to the rest of the Middle East. It's not interested. And so what we see is a whole host of regional middle powers rather than regional great powers. The competition between those 4 powers is over the 3rd tier, which are weak states or fragile states. And this competition manifests itself in relation to countries, for example, like Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, and the proliferation of weak states in the Middle East has given opportunity and a window of opportunity for the countries at the top to really compete with each other for greater power and dominance through the use of proxy powers and proxy actors, militia actors, non-state actors at the bottom of the pyramid. And so that's why we see, if you will, the mess, the chaos of the Middle East, or the emergence of a new architecture of power with 4 competing actors at the top, 2 on either side, competing really for the third tier, over the third tier, and a bunch of powers in the middle and top, and these guys take sides. And of course, this is occurring in a broader regional environment, in a broader international and global environment, with the US on one side and Russia on the other side. I simplified this, and I apologize for talking so fast. And I also apologize to both Olivia and Simon for taking so much time.